Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all so much for coming. My name is Mariam Khan, and I'm so honored to be here. Today, I'm going to be presenting on the harms of pathologizing fatness and medicalizing obesity in our normative healthcare practices. So, before I get into my argument, I wanted to make a reference to the popular trilogy series, The Hunger Games. For any of you who have read the book or watched the movie, you may recall that the main character grows up in an impoverished district, District 12, and she is brought into the elite society of the capital. And so this quote is her detailing her observations of the differences in ideal body types between those in her hometown of District 12 and those in the elite capital society. In District 12, looking old is something of an achievement since so many people die early. You see an elderly person, you want to congratulate them on their longevity. Ask the secret of survival. A plump person is envied because they aren't scraping by like the majority of us. But in the capital, it's different. Wrinkles aren't desirable, and a round belly isn't a sign of success. So the reason why I brought that quote up was to demonstrate this social construction element of health. So essentially what we see in this contrast between what is considered the ideal body type parallels the global standards and how they differ across high-income nations and low and middle-income countries with respect to what is considered the ideal healthfulness, and this is dependent on largely due to our assumptions about what resources and nutrition or lack of nutrition are present in those areas. And so the reason why I say that this is a social construct is that essentially our context and our cultures, our social norms, these shape our interpretations of health and even to what extent we add a value to a health status. And so this is very much connected to what it means to look healthy, so it takes it beyond what it means to simply be healthy, and instead, what is our perception of health and our sort of ideal look for health. And so our Western notion here in the US of looking healthy is very much underscored by this construct of obesity, so it's very weight-based. So the official definition of obesity is that it is a complex disease that occurs when an individual's weight is higher than what is considered healthy for his or her height. So if we look at this definition by the CDC, we see that there are certain parts of it that are kind of arbitrary, and they should raise some questions when we really break it down. For example, what makes obesity a complex disease? What makes it a disease in the first place? Who or what is determining what is considered healthy for one's height? What is the connection between weight and height, and how does that relate to health? Does it relate to health? So these are all things that, these are all questions that are kind of built into this definition, but we might not always think about when we kind of just accept this as a fact. And this classification is essentially justified as a risk factor for other comorbidities such as diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, stroke, cancer, pretty much like everything that we can think of, it somehow connects back to obesity. Sorry. And so so this is how the construct of obesity is justified, but we don't often consider the implications of this classification. So it's important for us to think about first, in the United States, which bodies are most targeted for obesity intervention. So when we think about, which populations do we consider to be more at risk, we look at, among other factors, we look at demographics, we look at socioeconomic status, we look at even race. And so we see that communities of lower income status, as well as racially marginalized and minoritized populations in the US, tend to have a higher risk of the comorbidities associated with obesity, which is interesting because if these are the people that are in larger bodies, this kind of contrasts what we see in other societies across place and time, where fatness used to, or having a larger body used to signify wealth and abundance. And now we see that the most vulnerable of our populations are at higher risk for not just having those comorbidities, but also being classified as obese or as having this complex disease. And so that leads to the second question, which is in the US, which bodies have been subjected to pathologization? So essentially, in our construct, in our social construct of health, which bodies have been deemed to be absent of, or to not have health, to not be deserving of health, or even to be antithetical to health in some way. And so my argument is that pathologizing fatness as a normative medical practice violates the ethical principle of justice. And so I will go into the white supremacist origins of pathologizing fatness, and then I will go into how the medicalization of obesity has very scientifically uncredible origins, and then how the contemporary medicalization of obesity that we still use today remains a construct of ideological whiteness. And so, therefore, medicine and public health should cease validating this construct of obesity as a proxy for worse health outcomes. Efforts to promote health should instead focus on reducing malnutrition. And so at the end of the presentation, I will propose a two-pronged approach to what else we can be doing as health professionals. Okay, so I would like to note that what I will be talking about today is going to be focused on the US in the specific socio-political and historical context of the United States. This is, essentially when I'm talking about, when did fatness first become unhealthy, I'm talking about this idea that, fatness, obesity, it's something that indicates that fatness is something that's inherently bad. And so it's important to think about this in the context of the US's origin, which was essentially a result of settler colonialism, and the movement to the United States, or what is now considered the United States, was done by creating a new colonial society. And so this colonial society had different roles that people of different ethnicities had to play, and this is how race came about. And so the reason why this is important is that the European colonizers who, came from their European countries had come from societies where fatness was connotated sociopolitical and economic power. And so when they started this new colonial society that had different class roles, they essentially brought West African slaves from during the transatlantic slave trade, and these Africans on average had larger body sizes than the average European. And so when these Africans already had larger body sizes, but they were going to play this role of unpaid labor in this capitalist system as slaves, then it would be illogical for the fatness to represent wealth when it's literally attached to the people who are at the bottom of that class hierarchy that's being created. And so this capitalist slave system necessitated a severing of fatness's connection to wealth status. And so from, perceiving fatness as an indicator of desirable abundance, the connotation then changes to undesirability and even greed. And we see that a lot today with stereotypes about those who are on the welfare system and those who, are lower socioeconomic status, but, are classified as obese. Okay. So now to come to what a lot of us, think about when we think about pathologizing fatness, which is obesity, how was it officially medicalized? So medicalized anti-fatness had already existed for decades in US healthcare. So essentially, although it was seen as undesirable from the origins of this country, it had to kind of evolve from undesirable to unhealthy, like in our systems. And so the obesity epidemic was officially termed sometime between the mid-1980s and early 2000s. So the undesirable perception existed before we started calling it a medical issue. And so this epidemic was essentially underscored by the CDC's 2004 infamous publication about on a study where obesity was claimed to be killing 400,000 Americans per year, and it was also claimed to be the number one cause of preventable deaths in the U.S. However, there were multiple journals that criticized this study because of its lack of scientific credibility. So the CDC researchers in this study estimated a figure by comparing the death rates of thin and heavy people using data that were nearly 30 years old, so not representing the population that this was being presented to. And although heavier people tend to die more frequently, it is by no means clear that their weight is the cause of their higher death rates. It is far more likely that their weight is simply a proxy for other more important factors such as their diet, exercise, or family medical history. And so if we think about statistics, anyone who has taken an introductory statistics class knows that causality and correlation are very different and should not be conflated. And so essentially, this was conflating correlation with causality, and it also used extremely old data. It didn't really look into the context. So the study was considered invalid, and then the CDC rescinded it. However, this discredited publication at that point had validated the pseudo-epidemic of obesity, meaning that even if it wasn't scientifically verified at the time, it exacerbated this societal panic about, this new epidemic that, was killing so many Americans, and now we, need to fund cures to figure out, how to solve it. And so the infamous BMI, can't talk about obesity without talking about the BMI. So the BMI is the body mass index. It is the main way of categorizing obesity. And it was created in 1832 by Adolphe Quetelet, a Belgian mathematician and sociologist who importantly did not study medicine, so he was not actually a health professional. He did not have any real expertise on health. And actually his reason for creating the BMI was not to, improve health outcomes. I mean, it was in, 1832, so it wasn't like this idea of the obesity epidemic existed then. But the reason why he created this was not for health, it was to categorize what he perceived as the ideal man. And so he based this categorization on standardized measurements of typical weights among French and Scottish cisgender white men, which clearly does not reflect or represent our population that we're dealing with in our healthcare system today. And importantly, the bell curve peak that he labeled after using these measurements, he labeled this as ideal rather than normal. So in statistics, when you have the bell curve, that's supposed to represent the normal or the average of the population, but he labeled it as an ideal. So he was already placing his own preconceived notions onto the sample size. And not surprisingly, the BMI scale was used to justify the eugenics movement in the US in the 20th century, and yet it was incorporated into the US health policy in 1985. Okay, so why do we continue medicalizing obesity given the problematic origins? So I argue that this is an example of a pervasive ideological whiteness in US medicine and public health. So as many of us know, medical racism is not just an individual problem. It's not just explicit acts of racism. It often isn't even individual implicit acts of racism. It's something that is maintained by a system to the point where we are perpetuating it like almost unconsciously. And so we see that in a lot of other examples of medicine, whiteness is embedded in our bioethics discourse and our medical systems. And so essentially what this means is when we don't identify whiteness in the ways in which we conceptualize and think about the epistemology in bioethics and medicine, public health, we essentially invisibilize the ideological whiteness that exists because we are not identifying it. So we kind of present it as universal, objective, neutral, and as the default. And so we see this even in the BMI, which is based off of othering non-white bodies. That's what the basis of it was. But we also see how it affects people today. We see how it affects the most vulnerable, racially marginalized populations today. Over half of the fat population in the US is Black. And so these are the people who are going to be most harmed from these interventions that aim to eradicate obesity. And additionally, because professional opinions of what obesity, when promoting this idea that obesity is a valid construct, aligns with commercial diet and fitness industries as corporate profit-based interests, this also results in a lot of psychological harm, physical pain, and even death for people, not just Black fat patients, but also many other people who suffer from eating disorders, and also, fat people who might be providers. And so this contradicts the WHO's holistic health goals because, health is, by the WHO's standards, not supposed to just be an absence of a disease or a condition, but rather a holistic, multifaceted sort of well-being, so physical, mental, intellectual, et cetera. And so when we just accept the obesity construct and we leave it unquestioned, we end up invisibilizing these white standards in our healthcare practice and system. And so this leads to medical weight discrimination, because how could it not? If you're being taught that, obesity and fatness over a certain average weight is bad, then there will be some sort of discrimination. And then this leads to health inequities, misdiagnoses, and higher mortality rates for fat patients, again, over half of whom will be Black. And so this denial of equitable healthcare access and treatment violates contextualized justice, meaning justice which is based on socio-political and historical context of the injustice at hand. And so my proposal is that we rethink how we promote nutrition in healthcare. And so I'm of the firm belief that we should be thoroughly interrogating, if not eliminating, medicalizing obesity. At the same time, it would be negligent to completely ignore the comorbidities that are associated with obesity. But at the same time, there are still problems with using obesity as an intermediary determinant or as a proxy variable, because the associated comorbidities may not actually be caused by fatness or by weight. And even if it were, the BMI is quantitative, so it lacks context for health, meaning that if we treat weight as the problem, then that means we are treating weight as the solution. So without context, that means that healthy and unhealthy weight regulation methods would essentially be equal without any context. So conflating weight with nutritional intake is really a problem, because then it allows for a lot of other health issues to kind of go undetected, such as eating disorders. And so instead, we should be focusing our efforts on malnutrition. And I expand this definition to not just include those who have scarce or no access to food, but also those who have limited access to nutrient-dense foods, as well as those who have higher reliance on ultra-processed, undernourishing foods. And I do want to address that larger bodies don't necessarily stem from malnutrition. Usually that's kind of a counter-argument that's brought up to, well, why don't we look at other things? But I think actually changing our approach to malnutrition would help to sever the connection between fatness and unhealthiness, because eradicating obesity as a proxy variable would help these fat patients who don't have these comorbidities to be properly treated and to not be misdiagnosed for something that is not based on their weight, as well as actually address health conditions for non-fat patients who may still have these comorbidities. And so the two-pronged approach that I suggest is that medicine and public health, because they are both a part of this issue of perpetuating and normalizing obesity as a construct, they should also both be a part of the solution. So medicine can prioritize holistic health understanding in medical education, so really looking at physical, mental, intellectual, spiritual, all the different elements of health. Again, eradicating, or at least thoroughly interrogating, the BMI usage, because, as we see, it's rooted in some very problematic things, and it may not even be entirely necessary. Challenging ideological whiteness and medical norms, just demonstrating respect to patients with higher risk of comorbidities. So even if patients do have a lower quote-unquote health status, that doesn't mean that they should be treated with disrespect. But how often are we seeing fat patients being treated with respect in clinical settings? And then connecting patients at risk for those other comorbidities mentioned with customized nutritional services. So really catering to their cultural and ethnic backgrounds, what they actually have available to them, what nutrients they have available to them, and their dietary restrictions. And then public health can shift their, oftentimes in public health, we hyperfixate on changing individual choices to, get rid of fatness, but this is not really feasible a lot of the time, and it's also very expensive. So we could shift our focus from individual behaviors to systemic factors. We can hold corporations accountable for selling nutrient-poor food and beverages, push for transparency in diet and exercise industry practices and advertisements, and how they're targeting certain populations to try and sell their products better or more effectively, implement public policies to monitor food quality, requiring nutrient-dense alimentation, addressing nutrient-poor food deserts, and conducting research on how to make this alimentation accessible to the food industry to disseminate. And so these are my conclusions to kind of wrap everything up. But the one thing that I will just touch on really quickly is I would like us all to reflect after this what other forms of ideological medical racism remain unchallenged within all of us. So, maybe there are things that we are learning in our schools or from our society that we kind of leave unchallenged. So what are the other forms of medical racism that, still go by without us really paying attention to it? Okay, well. Oh, also,
Thank you so much for a clearly well-researched and thoughtful and thought-provoking presentation. One of the things that, so I teach in a school of medicine, and I think one of the challenges we run into in teaching some of the things that you brought to us today is that both the medical students and the faculty still grapple with the tensions between the information that you presented, right, and some of the very strong norms and guidelines in medicine that still exist that are antithetical to what you just presented. And sometimes it's really hard to, especially to beginning learners, to, you have to kind of hold these two things until we can accomplish some of the things that you suggested. I didn't know if you have any, thoughts about how to go about that and teaching that to learners who may really be interested in getting this information, but also then have to kind of carry it with them and continue to battle this uphill battle against the norms that are still very strong in medicine around this. So I didn't know if you have any ideas about. I think it's a really hard problem. If you had any ideas about, from both a student perspective or like what faculty can do to help students carry that forward, I'd be really curious. Yeah.
Oh, I really like that question. Thank you. I think, so a lot of the things I like to study and think about are social justice related, and I think a lot of it has to do with this question that I asked earlier about what other forms of ideological medical racism remain unchallenged. And we have to think about it, how it operates in our systems, but also how it exists in ourselves. And so I think, obviously, this is not like a normative practice. So you're not going to really have a ton of tangible solutions on how to teach this yet. But I think it's really helpful to take time to reflect and really contemplate, because a lot of these questions I also had, it feels really weird to say, we don't need to categorize obesity. And even when I was making these presentation slides, I was like, I don't know if I'm really the right person to speak on this because there's so much I'm missing. But then I think about, the harms it's had on me and even my cultural community. We're not Black, but my family is of Indian origin. And I see the ways in which, they talk about their bodies and the kinds of foods they eat, but then they'll still eat them, but then they'll feel bad. And, is that really a healthy way to be thinking about nutrition and ourselves? So I think it really comes down to, even if we think about eating disorders, exercising disorders, like why do these things happen? Where do they come from? And I think really critically evaluating where we're at right now helps us to kind of move forward to get to where we could be. So the answers kind of reveal themselves as you start unpacking like what we're already assuming and what's wrong with it. So I think starting conversations with people and getting medical students to really critically engage would be the first step.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Miriam, for your presentation, and congrats on your award. It's very clearly well-deserved. And I appreciate you bringing up those colonial aspects and ties to a lot of our constructions on bodies and Blackness, and how a lot of our medicalization instincts are rooted in anti-Blackness in our society. So I'm curious to see either in what you read or what you're thinking about moving forward when we talk about the ways in which like anti-Blackness is pervasive, but how white centering is also at the core of a lot of our understandings of health and healthiness in our culture, and how that comes into play here, because many of your conclusions and suggestions are about being inclusive and being mindful, but sometimes we do have to focus on the other route, which is like that white center and focus. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
So I kind of heard half of that. The microphones are just really echoey, I'm sorry. So was your question about like the flip side of anti-Blackness being white-centric?
No, it was what do you think we should do in terms of deconstructing white-centeredness in our understanding of health and healthiness?
So you're saying how can we like kind of move away from just focusing on white-centric or talking about white-centric discourse?
Focusing on that for our understanding of health, right? Because here you're talking about being expansive and inclusive of all body types and forms. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't necessarily always address white-centeredness that's at the hands of a lot of our understandings of health.
I'm sorry, can you elaborate a little bit more? I really want to answer. I just want to understand it.
Okay, so in your early slides, when you were talking about how we look at the Black body, we pathologize the Black body because it was other to the white body. You kind of need that in that dynamic. You need to point to the other and determine that to be the problem, right? So for the white body to be healthy, the Black body has to be unhealthy. Mm-hmm. That doesn't necessarily go away sometimes when you're saying that no bodies have problems and everybody's body is acceptable. Mm-hmm. So my question is like, are you thinking about that element too to your argument and how you're challenging our understandings of healthiness overall?
Okay. Yes, I think. Okay, so the part about where I'm focusing on the BMI and focusing on how it's focused on the white body, but that still doesn't tell me what health actually is? Okay, yes. I guess a lot of the things that I think about are very white, about like how ideological whiteness operates, because it affects so many of us whether we're white or not. I don't think that is necessarily a universal thing. Whiteness didn't always exist, but it exists after the colonial period. So I think it's very hard to kind of detach the idea of health from that construct. But I do think in terms of like reimagining what health can look like, it has to be hand in hand with, decentering the white-centric norms. And that can look like, I'm not necessarily saying, normalize, like I'm not saying, oh, all bodies are, like there is a good body or there's a bad body, but I'm saying that like health is not something that is meant to be perfect. It's not meant to be ideal. And so we should stop trying to treat health as like an end goal, but instead treat it as a process. And, as long as we're on this earth, we should be helping better the health and making people feel this level of shame and hatred about themselves and systematically oppressing them in this way is not healthy. And so I think that health in itself can only be achieved if like we are moving away from the white-centric norms of health. But really I think the end goal would really just look like a holistic understanding of it rather than a specific image. I don't know if that answered anything. Also, thank you to Odia. She is my TA, so she always asks me like questions. She also helped me with this paper, as well as my professor, Dr. Ferryman, so thank you. Yes, thank you.
Well, first, can everybody hear me without distortion? Good. This is an odd auditorium, especially when you have so few people. So let me just say a word. I may get a little bit foggy when I'm talking because on September 4th, my wife and I were in an automobile accident. It totaled our car, left us with some physical injuries. She's actually came with me for the award that I got with three fractured ribs, and she's taking pain medications and so on. We've been together for 2/3 of a century. We started out, both grew up in the Bronx projects. We went to the same high school, same public school. I took a class with her once, I think in high school. She was on the commercial track because she was a woman, and women were supposed to help men by being secretaries or maybe a bookkeeper. I was, as it turned out, an honor student inadvertently because somebody told me I couldn't get into college because I was unfit. So I said, what do I have to get fit? They said, get all A's. And so I found out who the A students were. I asked, how do you get an A? And they said, but I don't know. I said, well, what do you do? And it turned out you actually had to study. You had to read the stuff and so on. So now I can advance it now? Let's see. Now I'm making stuff come that I don't want to come. So, let me see if I can make this go over here and hit this button. Not working. Okay. So now I'm back on slides. I want to thank Kehan Parsi and Matt Winia for nominating me. I was delighted to receive the nomination, but as I said to my wife after I received it, I write about the history. You can't even get a history panel into the ASBH. Normally, nobody's going to give me a Lifetime Achievement Award. Let's just accept the nomination. And then I was flabbergasted. I was really amazed that I actually got a Lifetime Achievement Award. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Kehan. I'd like to thank Toby and the committee for awarding me this. You must have been, a Bronx expression came to mind, which I can't say, but it's kind of like spitting against the wind, except I had a male organ in mind. My history books, Steve Latham helped me on the one about the AMA Code of Ethics. Larry A. McCullough and I worked together for 12 years to produce the Cambridge World History of Medical Ethics. And I also want to thank my editors. The only publications that would accept, not history publishers, not bioethics publishers, the only place you could go for a book on the history of medical ethics was with their Kluwer series at the time. And they backed me on any book I proposed, which was really sweet. Terry Moore recruited Larry and me to the Cambridge History. Warren Reich recruited me to participate in the first edition of the encyclopedia. After Princeton turned the manuscript down with saying it's unsellable, I had a chit-chat with Peter Olin, in which I told him that he had just published one of the worst books so bad that it gave bad books a bad name. And he said, "Hey, Bob, do you have anything that you might want to have published with Oxford?" So that's how I worked my way into Oxford. They're all true stories, by the way. Peter did not know what to do with structure of moral revolutions, and he held on to it for a long time and really didn't know what to do with it. But I was riding up an elevator with Art Kaplan, and I said, "Peter doesn't know what to do with my book." He said, "I've got a series. It's with MIT Press. Send me a manuscript. I'll get you a review. Up or down, we'll have it within a couple of months." I sent him the manuscript, and I got a maybe. Turned out that the reviewers liked it, but the publishers said, "Yeah." So I sent it the completed manuscript. We got 4 positive reviews, and they convinced the publisher to publish the book. Got virtually no play in bioethics, was picked up by bioethicists and medical ethics around the globe in bizarre libraries across the globe. They really liked it, and the Europeans loved it because it said bioethics was not invented in America, which they kind of appreciated because they had something to do with it. I was done writing books at this point. COVID hit, and I was bored. I get bored easily. And so, having nothing better to do, I picked up the 2 standard histories of bioethics, and I think if I can remember, yeah, I should go to the next slide. And the first and the earliest was by David Rothman. I met David. We were working on a Nuremberg Code project in Germany for the 50th anniversary, and we got on fine, and he was one of the few genuine historians of medicine who actually thought I might have something interesting to say. We were both found out we had been involved with civil rights and so on. I met other people involved with civil rights and anti-war protest movements involved with the Nuremberg Code thing, and it was terrific. And he wrote a really good book about how bioethics was born out of one whistleblower, Henry Beecher, with a little appendix about Peter Buxton, and a lot of committee work and regulations. And I thought it was a good book at the time, until I reread it. Let me see how I did that. The next book was, and that is The Standard History of Bioethics. That's by Al Johnson. We used to have summer camp. Before there was the ASBH, bioethicists would get together with the summer, and you could, I thought there ought to be a code of ethics for bioethicists. Everybody said it was impossible because, 1, bioethicists would never agree, and number 2, there were no precedents. So I wrote a series of articles which showed, 1, if you looked at what bioethical societies were saying, they all converge on certain central points. So there could be a code of ethics for bioethicists. And 2, I wrote one. And of course, everybody said, oh, this, that, the other thing, but it showed it was possible to do it. In the process of that, I became friendly with Al Johnson, who sought me out at summer camp, and we chatted, and he wanted to know more about Percival, which I was writing about at the time, Thomas Percival, first code of medical ethics in the English language, and we became friends. In that picture there, the Hastings Center put up a little thing at ASBH, and he was signing, I forget what, and they put over there as a gag thing, ethicist in advice 5 cents. And that's him doing that. I'll come back to him. Both of these men are friends. Both of these men are first-class intellectuals. But I disagreed. It's good. You're supposed to disagree with first-class intellectuals. Now, this is the book that Peter didn't know what to do with. It's called The Structure of Moral Revolutions. Anthony Appiah, who also writes about moral revolutions, wrote a really nice thing about it. And I really wanted to study change, moral change. How come abortion was absolutely prohibited? It was a sin. They wrote novels about it. And then it was acceptable. And then there were these groups ready to outlaw it again. And that interests me. I wanted to changing conceptions of death and dying and what you could do for dying patients. That interested me. And it struck me that these were elements worth exploring, but I was trained in a philosophy of science institute. I did not start out in ethics, wrote my doctorate on ethics, but that's where I started. And Thomas Kuhn had developed a theory of of scientific revolutions, and in kibitzing with Art Kaplan and with Baruch Brody and some other people who started out in philosophy of science, we kept saying, you know, bioethics reminds us of Kuhnian stuff. Nobody took it seriously. So I said, hey, maybe I should take it seriously. In doing that, I discovered that you have to have a dissident in order to have a moral revolution. And that dissident has to think differently, and other people have to accept this alternative way of thinking. So you need somebody who has seemingly new conceptions, convincing other people. These people work on straightening out the problems of the alternative conceptions, and they convince other people. And if you're getting none of them, you can turn morality on its head by what Kuhn said in science, a paradigm switch. Doctor is lords. Doctors knows best to patients' rights. You've got to respect your patient. Flipped. And that reminded me so much of Kuhn. So I reread Kuhn. I mean, COVID, what are you going to do? You might as well read stuff, right? And what I discovered was that Nicholas Copernicus, his favorite revolutionary, did not think up the idea that the earth goes around the sun rather than the sun going around the earth. It had been dreamed up by a Greek historian, Aristarchus, but that's not where Copernicus came across it. It turned out some Ptolemaic astronomers hitched onto this idea. Aristotle wrote a refutation of these Ptolemaic astronomers, which was very simple. If you have a ball and it's spinning, and you put anything on the ball that's spinning, it flies off. If the earth was turning around to make day and night, we're not flying off. So you've got counterexamples, and it's got to be the case that Copernicus' kooky idea, which is good for cutting out epicycles and giving you a cleaner calendar, has got to be wrong. And by the way, for 50 years, everybody laughed at Copernicus until Galileo came along. And Galileo did something, he was a mathematician, he did something really interesting. He took a carnival toy, the telescope, and of course he knew mathematics, he sharpened it. And then he looked up at a planet. A planet just meant in those times a moving star. A moving star, the planet Jupiter. And what he saw was what you see over there. A round ball with moons just like our moon. So Galileo said, it looks like Copernicus was right. Moreover, what Galileo did is he wrote a little book, Starry Messenger. And in it, he had a little appendix. This is how you make your own telescope. You don't believe me, look up and you'll see. He got adherence, and of course, as you all know, or as every school child should know, but doesn't because this is America, he put up in front of the Inquisitions and had permanent house arrest for the rest of his life. He escaped death, however. They didn't want to make a martyr of him. Okay, so with this conception in mind, that you've got to have a new idea, you have to have adherence to that idea, and they have to work out the wrinkles and make it acceptable for a large audience, I began to reread these early histories of bioethics. And as it says, if you can read the top thing, they presented bioethics as founded by white men in the United States, attending conferences, founding think tanks, serving on government committees, and filing some legal briefs. Okay? Problem number one, it was too US-centric. In 1964, the World Medical Association required informed consent, if possible documented, for doing innovative work on patients, experiments on patients. The idea of informed consent was accepted internationally before Tom Beecham wrote Principles of Biomedical Ethics. And it was not invented in America. More importantly, the people who invented it were veterans. They'd either fought in World War I or in World War II. They were aghast at the Nuremberg trials. They recognized that the Nuremberg Code, because it had no provision for surrogacy, could not be a practical code for experimenting on humans. Of course, then you couldn't do experiments on psychiatric patients, on children, and all sorts of other people, and people in the emergency department, and so on. And so they wanted to fashion an ethics code that made Nuremberg practical. So that was number one. And in 1964, they did the Helsinki Declaration. Number two, the 1960s, when America was aflame with the civil rights movement, with women's rights movements, feminism, later called feminism, and all sorts of groups protesting and asking for their rights. Totally gone. Mentioned by Rothman because he's a good historian, but never followed up. Ignored in what's his name's book. Sorry, I said I'd block on occasion. Okay, Johnson expressly rejects this view of the birth of bioethics. This astounded me. Bioethics moved with certain tranquility through the tempestuous moral turmoil of racism and warfare that was contemporaneous with its origins. So his experience of bioethics was in committees and conferences. So that's what he wrote about. But the work of revising the commandments of medical morality in such a way as to permit, even encourage medical progress was done in a relatively quiet manner. Now, the idea of bioethics, as he conceived it, was to facilitate medical progress. Dan Callahan, by the way, had the same idea. There were these nuisances that came up where you had these ethical disputes that were impeding medical progress. Let's get some experts trained in ethics in, and they would help doctors solve all these problems. The fact that there was endemic injustice in American healthcare was ignored. Maybe a conference or two, but by and large, ignored. Okay, so what I decided to do was invert that model. I began actually trying to figure out who made the stuff that happened before bioethics was named by Dan Callahan in 1974 that was appropriated by the bioethics movement, but given no credit, either in the history books or in actuality. I'll show you more about that. And the next slide. This is George Wiley. He was a UCLA chemistry professor. He was also on the faculty at Berkeley. He was at Syracuse University. And he was the founder of the National Welfare Rights Organization. NWRO is mentioned, I think, once or twice in both of these histories. He is not mentioned at all. If you go through Johnson's history, the only person of color that he mentions at all is one of his colleagues on a committee, but otherwise they are out of the picture. More or less the same with Rothman's book. Okay, so why is he interesting? He and the National Welfare Rights Organization secured patients' rights for Medicare and Medicaid from the Joint Commission. Now, what does the Joint Commission have to do with Medicare and Medicaid? He also did the same for the American Hospital Association. So when you've got a massive law passed like Medicare, Medicaid, it has to be implemented. And what the United States Congress did, they had some administrators look on how to implement it, and they said there's this accrediting body for healthcare organizations, JCAHO. Why don't we have them set out the standards for what a hospital or a healthcare organization has to meet in order to get funding from Medicare or Medicaid? Medicaid kind of is fuzzy because the states administered it. But these were supposed to be general standards, okay? Okay, so the Joint Commission asked for commentary, and Wiley jumped in at this point, and he said, I represent the NWRO. Your people, the people you're concerned with are the people I represent. I want to talk to you. And what they said, no. We'll come back to that. AHA also said no. Come back to that. What Wiley had at his beck and call was a civil rights organization, the National Welfare Rights Organization. This is one of their marches. He could get people with disabilities. He could get women nursing mothers. He could get them all behind picket signs, black, white, yellow. He was asking for the rights of all. Anyone of any color, any race, didn't matter. Any gender, didn't matter, who was receiving welfare, and they should all have basic rights. By the way, anybody guess what right number one was that he got out of JCAHO? No guesses? The right to be respected. If you know anything about charity medicine, they get no respect. I received charity medicine as a kid. I was very, very sick, and I was a guinea pig and so on. But finally, they got it under control. But the thing that always bothered me was my mother would get up really early in the morning, take my sister and I to some clinic, and we would wait for hours. And as a kid, I didn't mind playing, but I hated that my mother was standing there holding her sister, and I said, why aren't there any chairs? It struck me as nuts that there should be all these people waiting, and it never struck me to ask the deeper question, why do people have to stand in line at all? So the other right that's part of the Patient's Bill of Rights was a right to an advance appointment. You shouldn't be treated any differently than any other patient if you receive this kind of care. I don't want to take Wiley out of it. I want to give you bit of Wiley. I never met him. I only read about him in archives and other people's work. But I love this. For too long have the poor been required to wait interminable lengths of time for the most meager and inadequately and most stingily given out medical treatment. The poor have been kept on the short end of the medical facilities. We have access to sophisticated miracle treatment only as guinea pigs. The medical establishment have run a colonial empire on the poor, on the black, on the minorities. For too long have physicians protected their membership and controlled the numbers of needed health care personnel for economic gain and limited access to health care for people of the ghettos and barrios of our country. And guess who he gave this talk to? A meeting of healthcare executives. And he was obviously a powerful speaker. Now, my general argument that I'm getting at, these are 2 pages of the first edition of Beecham and Childress's Principles of Biomedical Ethics. And notice what is appropriated there, just sucked right into bioethics, as if it came from nowhere, a patient's Bill of Rights. And if you looked at the second page, you can see it on the top there, that's the Declaration of Helsinki from the World Health Organization that these veterans in Europe had put together, all just washed away. Now, African Americans are not the only other people who are kind of left out of this history. Women are as well. And my favorite woman of this period is Frances Oldham Kelsey. She was a Canadian American. I want you to notice that Frances is spelled with an E, not with an I. That's because she's a she. And my wife said to tell anecdotes in this book, and one of the anecdotes I said was she was a Canadian American. There was a fellowship open. She was basically a biochemist originally. There was a fellowship open at the University of Chicago. It was open to anyone in the world. And she applied for it. And she received a letter. Dear sir, we are proud to, etc. And throughout they assumed that she was a he. And she went to her advisor and she said, well, what should I do? And he said, what I would do as a man is I would go and take it. What you should do as a woman is show up and see if they have the Bronx epithet to say no to you then. And they gave her the fellowship. And she got an MD from Chicago. And she became an assistant editor or an associate editor for JAMA. And then she quit it all because she wanted to have kids. She married Dr. Kelsey, so that's the last name. Oldham is her maiden name, as they put it. And she served in family practice for a couple of years. And then she got a job at the FDA. And what happened at the FDA, what have I got next? Okay, okay. What happened at the FDA is there was this drug, thalidomide, and it was being used all over the world for pregnant women to help them sleep and to relax them and so on. And the drug company came in and said, it's been approved all over the world, it's used all over the world. And Kelsey said, you got 2 patients here. You only have data on mothers. What about the health of the fetus? Come back, give me the data, and I'll approve it. They didn't give her any clinical data. What they did was gave her testimonials from doctors and mothers. That's not data, right? So she pressed them. And then something odd happened. One of the odd things about having a notoriously bad parent is you want to do something different. So I'm blocking on his name, but the son of one of the people who carried out the Nazi Kindereuthanasie program, child euthanasia program, which killed children with disabilities in Nazi Germany. He decided that there not be any children with disabilities, and so he became a pediatric pathologist, and he began studying it, and he wrote a small study in an odd magazine which said that there were some fetal tissues which were abnormal from mothers carrying babies if the mother had taken thalidomide. It was not clear evidence. Kelsey discovered that, threw it in the face of the company, and the company says, you have not proved that this is a harmful drug. And they went over Kelsey's head. Now, at this time, there was no standard of proof at the FDA. It just wasn't. It was up to each individual person. So she wrote back, we're a healthcare administration. Our first criteria, our first standard is the health of patients, whether the patients be in utero or walking around in adults. Doesn't matter. Give me the data. They went above her head and above, twice, tried to get her fired. And then the evidence broke, and she became a hero. There's her receiving, I think, the Presidential Medal of Honor or something from JFK. And there's her at her 101st birthday. Now, she had turned against researchers. She had outed them. And if you take a look at what I think Rothman says about her, he says she was prepared to fight for informed consent, and she clarified the language of the Kefauver Amendment, which created the requirement of the Javits-Kefauver Amendment requiring informed consent for experimentation. And she fought for it, and she was rewarded. Here's how they put it. This is, I think I'm Rothman. She's the Lord's Almighty, she called them doctors. Calling them Lord's Almighty was uppity and unfeminine, and she was omitted from the standard narratives, except that Johnson claims that her reforms were not ethics. So standing up for patients in utero is not ethics. It's something else. He said it was moral courage. Well, it's only moral courage if it's a moral standard. But that's just, I couldn't follow. Oh, in case you doubt me, that's page 142. But the Lord's Almighty struck back. They took over the investigative drug branch of the FDA, and she became what one reporter called a bare desk bureaucrat. She was a taken out for ceremonial occasions, but not given any real responsibility. She fought for the whole time she was at the FDA, tooth and nail for protecting patients. And I just ran out of time. Okay. I'm going to give you the last two slides. Henry Beecher, 1950s, psychedelic drugs. I want you to, if you want to understand Beecher, you've got to read the first couple of paragraphs of his famous articles. And he says, human experimentation since World War II, blah, blah, blah. it must be said that that patients would not have been available if they'd been truly aware of the uses that would be made of them. And if you take a look at the italicized line, he was against unconsented or misconsented experimentation on patients. What he did in the 1950s was experiment with LSD and other drugs to see if they can be used as truth serums on college students and graduate students at Harvard who volunteered. And on top of that, since this was a government-funded experiment, they had to sign a waiver and release form so that there was some form, not a bioethics consent form, of consent. Open for questions. Everything I said was absolutely true and unquestionable.